The air inside the waiting room was heavy and thick with the smell of old wood and floor wax, and it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out by the nerves of everyone sitting there. The boy sat on a hard metal chair that was much too big for him, and his legs dangled just a few inches above the carpet, swinging back and forth without him even realizing it. He was staring at the floor, watching the dust motes dance in the thin beam of light that came from a small window near the ceiling, and he tried to focus on the dust instead of the noise that was coming from behind the big double doors at the end of the hall. It was the sound of piano music, but not the kind of music that makes you want to hum along. It was fast and loud and complicated, and every time a note was played wrong or a rhythm was stumbled, the boy could hear a low groan ripple through the other people waiting in the hallway with him. He looked around at the other kids who were waiting for their turn, and he felt very small and out of place. All the others were teenagers. Some of them looked like they were almost adults, with long arms and large hands that could stretch across the piano keys with ease. They were all dressed in shiny black shoes and crisp white shirts, and the girls had their hair pulled back tight into buns that looked painful. They walked up and down the hallway whispering to each other and moving their fingers in the air as if they were playing invisible keys on the wall. Some of them were shaking their hands out to keep the muscles loose, and some were taking deep breaths with their eyes closed, trying to find a calm place inside their minds. But the boy just sat there, clutching his folder of sheet music against his chest so hard that his knuckles turned white. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt that his mother had ironed for him that morning, and the sleeves were just a little bit too short, showing his wrists, which looked thin and fragile compared to the strong wrists of the older students around him. He thought about how he had gotten there and how long he had practiced for this moment. He remembered the days when he would come home from school and go straight to the piano in the living room while his friends were outside playing soccer or riding their bikes. He remembered the blisters on his fingertips and the frustration when his hands just were not big enough to reach the chords that the music demanded. But he also remembered the feeling when he finally got it right, when the music flowed from his hands like water and the whole world seemed to disappear. But sitting in that hallway listening to the incredible talent of the other students made all that practice feel like it might not be enough. He wondered if the judges would just take one look at him and laugh before he even played a single note. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and the clock on the wall ticked so loudly that it sounded like a hammer hitting a nail with every second that passed. The boy wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers and tried to swallow, but his throat felt dry like he had been eating sand. He looked at the folder in his hands and he wondered if he should have chosen a different piece, maybe something simpler, something that was safe and that he could play without making a mistake. But then he thought about the feeling of the keys under his fingers and the sound that he wanted to make, and he knew that he could not play it safe, not today, not when he had come this far. A tall girl with dark hair walked past him and looked down at him with a look that was not mean but was pitying, like she knew something he did not, and she whispered good luck to him, but her voice said, "You are going to need it." The boy just nodded his head and looked back at the floor. He could hear the piano behind the doors stop, and there was a moment of silence that felt like it lasted for 100 years, and then the sound of polite clapping followed by a voice over the speaker system calling the next number. The boy watched as another teenager stood up and walked confidently through the double doors, smoothing his shirt and checking his hair in the reflection of the glass. As he passed, the doors swung shut behind him and the hallway was quiet again. The boy shifted in his seat and tried to find a comfortable position, but there was none. His heart was beating so hard that he could feel it thumping against his ribs like a bird trying to break out of a cage. He looked at the adults who were standing against the wall, parents and teachers whispering to each other and pointing at the students. He saw a mother adjusting her son's tie and a father giving a thumbs up to a girl who looked like she was about to cry. He wished his own parents were sitting there, but they were out in the audience waiting and listening, and he was alone in this hallway with his fear and his music. He thought about the piano that was waiting for him on the other side of those doors. It was a massive grand piano, black and shiny and perfect, and he wondered how it would feel to sit on the bench and reach for the pedals. Would his feet reach the floor, or would he have to stretch? He thought about the judges sitting at their long table with their clipboards and their serious faces and their pens ready to write down every mistake that he made. He knew that they were expecting great things from the older students, but he did not know what they were expecting from him, if they were expecting anything at all. The sound from the auditorium changed, the music became faster and more intense, and the boy recognized the piece. It was one of the standard sonatas that everyone played, and the person playing it was playing it very well, but there was no emotion in it. It was just a series of notes played perfectly, and the boy realized that playing the notes right was not enough. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath and tried to picture the music in his head, not just the black dots on the page but the story. That the music was telling the story of a storm and a struggle and a victory. He let the melody fill his mind, and slowly the thumping of his heart began to slow down just a little bit. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands. They were small hands, but they were his hands, and they had learned to do things that seemed impossible. He flexed his fingers and imagined them flying over the keys, creating the sounds that he wanted to hear. The doubt was still there, gnawing at the back of his mind, but underneath the doubt there was a tiny spark of anger, a determination to show them that he belonged there, that he could do this. He looked up at the clock again and saw that only a few minutes had passed, even though it felt like hours. The double doors opened again, and the teenager who had gone in earlier walked out. His face was pale and he looked shaken, like he had just survived a hurricane. He walked past the boy without looking at anyone and went straight to his parents, who hugged him. A man in a suit came out of the doors and held a clipboard in his hand. He looked down the line of students and his eyes moved past the older kids and landed on the boy. He called out a number and the boy froze for a second, realizing that it was his turn. He stood up slowly and his legs felt a bit wobbly, like they were made of jelly. He grabbed his folder and took one last look at the empty chair that had been his safe place for the last hour. Then he turned towards the doors. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the hallway on him, watching the little kid who was about to walk into the lion's den. He took a step forward and then another, walking towards the sound of the piano and the smell of the old wood and the lights that were waiting for him. Walking through those heavy double doors felt like stepping out of a dark cave and directly into the blinding sun. The lights on the stage were incredibly bright and they shone down into his eyes, making it impossible to see anything beyond the edge of the wooden platform where the piano sat like a great black beast waiting for him. He could feel the heat from the spotlights on his face and on the top of his head, and he squinted, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness beyond the footlights. He knew that hundreds of people were sitting out there in the shadows watching him in silence, but all he could see was a vast empty void that seemed to go on forever. His shoes made a squeaking sound on the polished floorboards and the noise echoed through the huge hall, sounding like a thunderclap in the quietness of the room. Every step he took felt heavy and clumsy, like his legs were made of lead, and he had to remind himself to just breathe and keep putting one foot in front of the other. The piano was enormous. It was a shiny black concert grand that seemed to take up half the stage, and as he got closer to it he felt even smaller than he had in the hallway. The lid was propped open and the reflection of the stage lights danced on the glossy surface like stars on a dark night. He walked around to the bench and realized that it was set too high for him. The previous pianist had been a tall person and now the boy had to reach up to grip the edges of the seat. He awkwardly scrambled up onto the leather cushion and his feet dangled above the pedals, swinging slightly like pendulums. He reached down and tried to find the pedal with his foot, but he had to stretch his leg all the way out just to make contact with the brass rod. It was a reminder to everyone watching that he was just a child in a world built for adults. He sat there for a moment, smoothing out his shirt with his trembling hands and trying to compose himself. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was a heavy, thick silence that pressed down on his ears and made his own breathing sound loud and ragged. He looked up toward the table where the judges were sitting and he had to shield his eyes with his hand just to see them. There were 3 people behind the long table, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the man in the middle. This was the famous maestro, a veteran pianist who had played in every major concert hall in the world and who was known for his temper and his sharp tongue. The maestro was older, with silver hair and a face that looked like it was carved from stone. He was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest, looking at the boy with an expression of utter boredom and perhaps even a little bit of annoyance. The maestro sighed a long loud sigh that seemed to carry all the way to the back of the auditorium. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at the program in front of him as if he could not believe who was standing on the stage. He did not see a musician, he only saw a small child who was taking up valuable time in a competition for serious artists. The boy watched him and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew that this man held his fate in his hands and that the maestro had already made up his mind before a single note had been played. The boy placed his hands on his knees and waited for the signal to begin. His heart was hammering so hard against his ribs that he thought it might break through, and the sweat on his forehead was starting to drip down into his eyes, making them sting. Instead of just nodding or giving a polite gesture to start, the maestro leaned forward slowly and tapped his microphone, making a sharp thudding sound that made the boy flinch. The hall was so quiet that the sound was like a gunshot, and the boy jumped slightly in his seat, which caused a few ripple of quiet chuckles from the darkness of the audience. The maestro ignored the laughter and looked straight at the boy with a gaze that was cold and unyielding. He did not speak with encouragement or kindness. He spoke with the weariness of a man who had seen too many mediocre performances and just wanted to go home. His voice boomed through the speakers, and it was filled with a condescending tone that made the boy feel about 2 inches tall. The maestro told the boy that he looked very young, and he asked him if he was lost. He joked that perhaps the school bus had dropped him off at the wrong building and that the playground was outside. A few more people laughed in the audience, but it was a nervous, uncomfortable laughter that died out quickly. The boy sat frozen on the bench, his face turning bright red with embarrassment and shame. He wanted to run off the stage and hide in the bathroom, but he was glued to the spot. The maestro waved his hand in the air dismissively as if shooing away a fly, and he told the boy not to waste their time with something that was too difficult for him. He said that they had heard enough scales and nursery rhymes for one day, and he told the boy to play something easy, something simple, so that they could all move on to the next contestant. The words hung in the air like smoke, and the boy felt a sudden flash of anger deep inside his chest. It was a small spark at first, but it grew quickly, burning away the fear and the shame. He looked at the maestro and saw a man who thought he knew everything, a man who judged books by their covers and people by their size. The boy realized that nothing he could say would matter. The only way to prove him wrong was to play. The boy reached for his folder on the music rack, and his hands were steady now. The trembling was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He opened the folder and pulled out the sheets of paper that contained his music. The maestro rolled his eyes and leaned back in his chair again, preparing to endure a butchered version of a simple melody. He picked up his pen and started to tap it on the table, looking at his watch, clearly counting down the seconds until this ordeal was over. The boy placed the music on the stand and arranged the pages carefully. He did not choose a simple folk song or a beginner's exercise. He chose the piece that he had spent months practicing, the piece that had made his fingers bleed and his muscles ache. The title was printed clearly at the top of the page in bold black letters, and even from the table the maestro could see what it was. He squinted his eyes and leaned forward, suddenly interested despite himself. The boy took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keys, ready to show the old man that easy was not in his vocabulary. The paper on the music stand was white and bright under the stage lights, and the black notes printed on it looked like a swarm of angry insects crawling across the page. The title at the top was written in bold letters, and it was a name that every single person in that hall recognized instantly. It was the Etude Opus 25 number 11 by Frédéric Chopin, but everyone knew it by a different name. They called it The Winter Wind, and it was one of the most feared and difficult pieces ever written for the piano. The maestro leaned forward in his chair so abruptly that he almost knocked over his glass of water. He squinted his eyes and stared at the music rack as if he could not believe what he was seeing. His mouth opened slightly and then closed again, and a look of genuine shock replaced the boredom that had been there just a moment before. He looked from the paper to the small boy sitting on the bench and then back to the paper, as if trying to solve a puzzle that did not make any sense. The boy did not look at the judge. He kept his eyes focused on the keys, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He could feel the tension in the room shifting. The air seemed to crackle with electricity, and the silence became even deeper and heavier than before. The people in the audience were craning their necks, trying to see what music was sitting on the rack, and as the realization spread through the crowd, a low murmur began to rise like the sound of wind blowing through dry leaves. It was a sound of disbelief and anticipation, and even a little bit of fear for the boy who was about to attempt the impossible. Everyone knew that this piece was not just about playing the right notes, it was about power and speed and endurance. It required a hand that could span large distances and a technique that took decades to master. It was a piece that professional pianists often avoided in public because the risk of failure was so high. The maestro tapped his pen on the table again, but this time it was not out of boredom, it was out of nervous habit. He shook his head slowly and leaned toward the microphone, his voice coming out a bit strained and hesitant. He asked the boy if he was sure about his choice. He told him that there was no shame in playing something simpler, that he could still win a prize for a nice performance of an easier piece, but that attempting this was like walking into a storm without a coat. The advice was meant to be kind in a way, but it still sounded condescending coming from the older man, who assumed that a child could not possibly understand the magnitude of the task he had chosen. The boy did not answer, he simply nodded his head once, a sharp definite movement that showed he had made up his mind and there was no going back. He reached up and adjusted the sleeves of his shirt, rolling them up slightly past his wrists to give his arms complete freedom of movement. His forearms were thin and pale, but the muscles were tense and ready underneath the skin. He placed his hands on the keys and started to stretch his fingers. He spread his thumb and his pinky as far apart as they would go, feeling the pull in the tendons of his palm. He knew that the opening of the piece was deceivingly quiet, a slow and mournful melody in the left hand that would lull the listener into a false sense of security, but he also knew what was coming. The right hand had to execute rapid and relentless arpeggios that mimicked the howling of a bitter winter gale, and they had to be played with a volume and ferocity that drowned out everything else. The boy took a deep breath and filled his lungs with the dusty air of the stage. He closed his eyes for a split second and pictured the music in his mind not as notes on a page but as a physical force, like a wave crashing against a cliff. He imagined the sound filling the entire hall and washing over the skeptical judge and silencing the whispers in the crowd. He thought about all the hours he had spent in his living room playing the same few bars over and over again until his fingers burned and his wrists ached. He remembered the frustration of dropping the melody and the determination that had made him start again. Immediately he let all of those memories fade away until there was nothing left but the rhythm and the feeling of the keys beneath his fingertips. The maestro sat back in his chair and crossed his arms, but his eyes were fixed on the boy's hands with an intensity that burned. He had seen many students try to play this piece over the years, and he had seen most of them fail. He had seen strong hands crumble under the pressure, and he had seen confident faces turn pale as the music became too fast to control. He was waiting for the moment when the boy would realize his mistake. He was waiting for the crash, but a small part of him, a tiny seed of hope buried deep under his cynicism, was wondering what would happen if by some miracle the boy actually pulled it off. The boy shifted his weight on the bench and planted his feet firmly on the floor, stretching his leg to reach the pedal. He knew that the pedal work was just as important as the fingers. It had to be precise and clean, because any blurring of the sound would turn the music into mud. He looked down at the black and white keys, and for a moment they seemed to glow in the spotlight. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, a feeling of rightness, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The fear was still there, hiding in the corners of his mind, but it was small now and it was under control. He was ready to speak without using his voice. He was ready to let the piano do the talking. The audience had gone completely silent again. The murmurs had died down and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the first sound. It was the kind of silence that you could feel in your chest, a collective holding of breath by hundreds of people, all wondering if they were about to witness a tragedy or a triumph. The boy raised his hands slightly above the keys, his fingers curved and poised like the claws of a bird about to take flight. He looked one last time at the music stand, not to read the notes but to acknowledge the composer who had written them over a century ago, a man who had understood pain and passion and beauty better than anyone. The maestro stopped tapping his pen. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his chin resting on his intertwined fingers. He was no longer the bored judge waiting for his lunch break. He was a musician witnessing a moment of potential history. His eyes were narrow and his face was unreadable, but his body language screamed attention. The boy closed his eyes for a brief second and then opened them again, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance beyond the audience. He was no longer in the concert hall. He was in the world of the music, where the wind was blowing and the winter was cold, and only the sound of the piano mattered. The first sound that came out of the piano was not a roar but a whisper. It was a soft and mournful melody that floated gently into the air like a lonely cloud drifting across a gray sky. The boy played the opening chords with a tenderness that seemed to contradict the tension in his shoulders. His fingers caressed the keys rather than striking them, and the sound was rich and full of sadness. The maestro sat still with his pen hovering over his paper, expecting the simple melody to crumble at any moment. He waited for the wobble in the rhythm or the wrong note that always betrayed a nervous student, but the boy played with a steady hand and a calmness that was eerie. The quiet notes hung in the vast space of the hall, and the audience leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear the delicate sound. Then the mood changed abruptly. The boy's right hand began to move, and it was like a switch had been flipped from calm to chaos. The notes started to climb, and they grew faster and louder with every beat. Suddenly the famous arpeggios began, the rapid cascade of notes that gives the piece its name, the winter wind. It was a sound that mimicked the howling of a gale force wind blowing through the cracks of an old house. The boy's hand became a blur of motion across the keyboard, his fingers striking the keys with a velocity that was frightening to watch. The sound was no longer a whisper, it was a torrent, a waterfall of noise that flooded the entire stage and washed over the judges' table. The maestro jerked his head up and his eyes went wide behind his spectacles. He stopped tapping his pen entirely and let it fall onto the table with a clatter that no one heard because the piano was so loud. He stared at the boy's hands, trying to understand how someone so small could generate such power. The boy's arm was moving up and down with the weight of a piston, driving the fingers into the keys with relentless force. The music was technically demanding, requiring the thumb to cross under the pinky finger continuously while maintaining a perfect rhythm and a volume that was overpowering, yet the boy did it effortlessly. His hand glided over the keys like a spider running across a web. The movements were so fluid that it looked like he had no bones in his fingers at all. The audience was paralyzed. Every person in the hall was fixed on the stage, their mouths slightly open in disbelief. They had expected a cute performance, maybe with a few mistakes, but instead they were witnessing a display of virtuosity that was rarely seen in musicians twice the boy's age. The sound of the piano was enormous. It filled the dusty corners of the ceiling and shook the floorboards under their feet. The bass notes thundered like the approach of a storm, while the treble notes danced above them like lightning bolts. The boy was completely lost in the music now. His eyes were closed and his head was swaying slightly from side to side as if he was being pulled by an invisible string. He was no longer the small child on the big bench, he was a giant, he was a force of nature. The physical effort was beginning to show on his face. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple and dripped onto his collar, but he did not flinch. His breathing was heavy and rhythmic, matching the phrasing of the music. His small legs stretched out desperately, trying to find stability on the floor to anchor his body against the onslaught of the notes. He had to navigate the most difficult part of the piece, where the left hand plays a heavy melody while the right hand continues its frantic storm above it. The coordination required was immense, and a single slip would ruin the entire effect, but the boy did not slip. His hands moved independently of each other, the left hand digging deep into the keys for the melody while the right hand skittered over the top like ice on a window pane. The maestro uncrossed his arms and leaned forward until his chest was almost touching the edge of the table. He had a look of utter astonishment on his face. He looked from the boy's hands to his face and then back to the hands, trying to find the trick or the illusion, but there was none. It was just pure raw talent and hours of grueling practice. He realized that this child was not just playing the notes, he was understanding the emotion behind them. The music was not just fast, it was angry, it was passionate, it was a fight for survival, and the boy was channeling every ounce of that energy into his fingertips. The cynical sneer that the maestro had worn earlier was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound respect and wonder. The volume of the music grew until it felt like the ceiling might come down. The boy was attacking the keys now, throwing his whole body into each chord. The sound was a wall of noise that was terrifying and beautiful all at once. The people in the front rows covered their ears, not because it was unpleasant but because it was so intense. The vibration of the strings resonated in their chests, making their hearts beat faster along with the rhythm. The boy's fingers were flying so fast that they looked like 10 little hammers striking an anvil. The sweat was pouring from his forehead, now soaking his hair, but he did not stop, he did not hesitate. He drove the music forward with a relentless momentum that seemed impossible to sustain. As the piece reached its climax, the boy's face contorted with the effort, his teeth were clenched and his neck muscles were strained tight. He was lifting his hands high off the keys and bringing them down with tremendous force, creating crashes of sound that echoed like thunder. The piano was screaming under his hands, but he remained in total control. He was the master of the instrument and he was making it do things that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The audience had forgotten to breathe. They were watching a miracle unfold right in front of their eyes, a small boy defeating a giant with nothing but his talent and his courage. The music swelled to a fever pitch, a chaotic roaring storm that threatened to consume everything in its path, and then just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos started to resolve. The boy's hands began to slow down, the rapid arpeggios turned back into the heavy chords, and then the chords gave way to the quiet melody from the beginning. The storm was passing, the wind was dying down, and the sun was coming out. He played the final phrases with a heartbreaking gentleness, the last notes hanging in the air like frost on a winter morning. He held his hands over the keys for just a moment, letting the sound fade away into complete silence until there was nothing left but the ringing in the ears of the audience and the heavy breathing of the boy on the stage. The silence that followed the final note was not empty or quiet, it was a heavy, thick silence that seemed to press down on the roof of the concert hall. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people are so stunned that they forget how to breathe. The sound of the piano had faded away completely, leaving only the ghost of the music vibrating in the air and in the bones of the people sitting in the audience. The boy sat on the bench with his hands resting in his lap, his fingers curled inward slightly as if they were still gripping the keys. He was staring straight ahead at the black felt of the piano, but his eyes were not focused on anything. He was just trying to calm the racing of his heart, which felt like a bird trapped in his chest. A drop of sweat rolled down the side of his face and dripped onto his white collar, but he did not move to wipe it away. His entire body was exhausted, his muscles were trembling from the immense effort he had just expended, and he felt a strange lightness in his head, like he was floating a few inches above the bench. He could hear a faint ringing in his ears, which was the only sound left in the world. He took a deep, shaky breath and let it out slowly, and that small sound seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Suddenly a sound came from the back of the hall. It was a single person clapping slowly and rhythmically, and then another person joined in, and then another. Within seconds the silence shattered and exploded into a roar of applause that was so loud it seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. The audience was on its feet as one single body, hundreds of people standing up and clapping their hands together with a ferocity that matched the music they had just heard. They were shouting and whistling, and some people were even wiping tears from their eyes with the backs of their hands. The sound washed over the stage like a tidal wave crashing over the shore, and the boy sat in the middle of it, looking small and fragile against the massive black piano. The maestro sat at the judges' table and he did not stand up immediately. He remained in his chair with his elbows resting on the table and his chin resting on his hands. He was looking at the boy with an expression that was hard to describe. It was a mixture of shock and wonder, and perhaps a little bit of shame for having doubted him. The boy slowly turned his head and looked out into the audience. He could not see individual faces because the spotlights were too bright, but he could see the shapes of the people standing, and he could feel the energy of their appreciation coming toward him like heat from a fire. A shy smile slowly spread across his face. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made his whole face light up. It was the smile of a child who is relieved and happy and a little bit surprised by what he has just done. He stood up from the bench and his legs felt a little bit wobbly like a newborn deer learning to walk, but he steadied himself and walked to the center of the stage. He bowed deeply from the waist, holding the position for a long moment as the applause continued to rain down on him. When he stood up straight again, he looked directly at the judges' table, and the maestro slowly raised his hands and began to clap as well. He did not clap with the polite half-hearted applause of a board official. He clapped with sincerity and respect, and then he did something that he rarely did for any contestant. He took off his glasses and wiped them slowly with his handkerchief before putting them back on and nodding at the boy. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. It was an acknowledgement that the boy had earned his place on that stage, not through pity or luck but through sheer talent and grit. The boy gave another small bow and then turned to walk back to the piano to collect his sheet music. His hands were shaking so badly now that the papers rattled against each other as he picked them up. He tucked them under his arm and turned toward the side of the stage where the heavy curtains led back to the wings. As he walked away from the piano, the sound of the applause followed him, echoing off the walls and filling his ears with a warm hum. He walked through the curtains and into the cool darkness of the wings, and the bright lights of the stage faded behind him, leaving him in the shadowy quiet of the backstage area. A man in a suit was standing there waiting for him, the same man who had led him onto the stage earlier, but now the man looked at him with a completely different expression. There was no impatience on his face now, only awe and respect. He reached out and shook the boy's hand vigorously, telling him that it was the best performance he had heard in years. The boy just nodded his head, unable to find his voice. He felt drained, like a battery that had been completely emptied of all its power. He walked down the long hallway toward the dressing rooms, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. The sound of the audience was still audible in the distance, a dull roar that reminded him of what he had just accomplished. When he rounded the corner, he saw his parents standing there looking anxious and hopeful. His mother had her hands clasped together in front of her chest, and his father was pacing back and forth. When they saw him, they both stopped, and his mother let out a small cry and rushed forward to wrap him in a hug. She was crying tears of happiness and pride, and she held him tight as if she was afraid he might disappear. His father came over and put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing it gently and beaming with pride. They did not ask him how it went because they already knew. They had heard the applause and they had seen the standing ovation. The boy leaned against his mother and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the strength and love of his family surrounding him. He realized that he had done it not just for the judges or the audience, but for them and for himself. He had proven to the world that being small did not mean being weak, and that having a simple title did not mean you could not play the hardest pieces. He knew that there would be other days and other challenges, and that he would have to practice even harder next time, but for right now, in this moment, he felt like the king of the world. They walked together toward the exit of the concert hall, pushing through the heavy doors and stepping out into the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the street and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The boy took a deep breath of the fresh air and looked up at the sky. He felt lighter than he had ever felt before, as if the weight of the piano and the expectations of the judges had all been lifted off his shoulders. He knew that he would never forget this day. As long as he lived, he would remember the feel of the keys, the sound of the wind in the music, and the look on the maestro's face when he realized that the kid with the small hands had played the hardest piece instead of the easy one. And he smiled, knowing that he had found his voice in the music and that nothing could ever take that away from him.